Welcome to More Than a Refresh and the Open Source Observability Day interviews. Today, our guest is Dotan Horovits, CNCF Ambassador and OpenObservability Talks podcast host. Beyond what I have just said, Dotan, please introduce yourself.
Hey JD, pleasure being in here on the podcast. And so I'm Dotan Horovits. I'm a DevOps specialist, if you'd like, developer advocate, same as you and many others in out there. And then I've been working in the DevOps and observability space for many years with vendors, with open source projects, with the community. Obviously, currently between jobs, so nothing to say about the current one. But if you have something interesting, let me know. As you mentioned, I run the OpenObservability Talks podcast about open source and observability. So that's the perfect fit for the Open Source Observability Day. And now it's actually on its 5th year. So if you're podcast fans, and you probably are if you're listening to this one, then check it out on YouTube or your favorite podcast apps. That's me. And as you mentioned, also CNCF Ambassador. CNCF is as in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, with special focus on cloud native observability and all the related projects like Prometheus, Jaeger, OpenTelemetry, and the like. So, if you have questions about the cloud native stack, also feel free to DM me, I guess.
Yeah, well, I definitely will make sure that your podcast gets put out there. And we do want to talk a little bit about CNCF, but I'd like to offer a reframe. You are not in between jobs. You are on sabbatical seeking your next opportunity.
I love that one. I'm going to use that.
All right. So let's talk about CNCF a little bit. I've been doing cloud stuff since before cloud was a marketing term, back in the old days when you'd have jails or zones or virtual hosting, that type of thing. So what is CNCF all about?
So the CNCF, it's an open source foundation, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Probably people know the Linux Foundation that backs the Linux project. So very similarly, the CNCF backs Kubernetes. So that's a place where Kubernetes lies, as well as many other popular projects, like I mentioned, Prometheus and OpenTelemetry and Jaeger. That's only observability, but obviously also Argo and many others at CD. And so probably you'll find, whoever is listening, you'll find a project that you are using or have used that is part of the CNCF stack. All about obviously containerization and containerized workload, but by now already even much beyond that as well. So platform engineering, internal developer platforms, you name it, it's there. FinOps. So that's the CNCF in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, in my world, which is obviously Postgres and related technologies around that, we have, cloud native Postgres, which was primarily developed by Gabriel, great controller operator for Kubernetes for Postgres. I got to be honest, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with containerization. I think, and this isn't, this is true of any, although Kubernetes is new, it's new in the scope of, my career. Any popular technology that takes off, you end up in this situation. But I think that you get a lot of people trying to use containerization in a way that isn't a very good idea. I'm still not a fan of containerizing Postgres. And when I say that, I don't have a problem with VMware. I don't have a problem with Incus. Do a little bit of a problem with Docker, but not for testing and staging. It's more the idea that Postgres can, safely be dynamically allocated to various containers, resources, and start. And yes, a lot of hard work has gone into making that viable, but that viability comes at such an extreme cost of complexity for Postgres that to me, it's just not worth it. Now, don't get me wrong, for a lot of other things, go for it, right? I mean, Nginx or whatever, those types of things, when you got to fire up a load balancer or a proxy or, any of that type of stuff, I think that's fantastic. But sometimes there's a comfort that comes from having that resource just available.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But anyway, so okay, so cloud native computing foundation. We know that this is an important thing. Like you said, you probably heard of Linux Foundation. I have. In fact, I went to unsubscribe from one of their mailing lists just because it didn't really apply to me anymore. And I realized that they're actually using many, many, many years ago, I was given a Linux.com email address from VA Linux because of my advocacy work with Linux Documentation Project and a bunch of other stuff. And I still have it. But I didn't know they were using it. So I went to unsubscribe and they're like, we have unsubscribed, at Linux.com. And I was like, whoa, okay, let's look at this. Um, so cloud native, let me ask you this about the cloud native foundation. Does the technology that is submitted have to be open source?
Yeah, the CNCF projects are open source. The landscape, if you open the what people know as the monstrous landscape, the huge landscape, that includes also companies, organizations, but the projects themselves are open source.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I mean, I think where that's coming to a head a little bit, but one of the best things that happened to open source was corporate involvement. And now I would argue that right now, one of the worst things that is happening to open source is corporate involvement. But that is, that's the tightrope we walk, right? Because corporate involvement isn't going to happen unless there's money to be made, period. And that's on purpose. And that's good because you got to pay people. But on the other hand, you have corporations that get involved because of buzzword compliance. And then when they don't understand how it all works, they end up screwing communities over. And that's a bad thing. But I mean, what do you do about it, right? I mean, people have to have something to argue about. So,
Yeah. No, although I do think that, first of all, it is important. I used to work for vendors that are involved in open source, so I have nothing bad to say against vendors. But it is important when a vendor decides that open source is part of its strategy to understand what it is exactly, to really have a strategy and to make sure that it's clear that open source is not a business model. I see many startup entrepreneurs making that mistake. So choosing open source does not mean that you've resolved your business strategy. You need to actually put the business strategy in place, understand what's your differentiation, and then really understand what you're going to open source and contribute upstream, and what are the parts that it's okay for you to keep as part of your commercial offering on top of the open source. So the open source need to justify itself. You can't empty it from any value, otherwise it will not it will just be a marketing stunt. But once you have an open source that is viable and provides its own value on its own right, then you need a commercial offering that supplements it and can provide your revenue model and your business model around it. It could be services, it could be products, it could be many others, but still that's something that I see, especially young startups, especially today when everything needs to be open source, or at least that's what they feel, that they jump this part, go straight to the open source. And sometimes they have very successful open source projects, but the company does not survive. And then either the startup shuts down, or even large corporates, even public companies, then suddenly you see pulling the bait and switch stunt, changing the license underneath your feet. And we've seen that recently with Redis and with Terraform, and also in the observability space, apropos the open source observability day with Grafana and with Elasticsearch a few years back. So it happens all around, and it's something definitely that is, I assume when you said it's also the worst that can happen with corpse behind that, that's probably something you had in mind when you said that.
Yeah. And, I think it should be made clear, though, that open source is not a business model, granted. But that hasn't changed anything. I mean, I think that, any company that it doesn't matter if it's clothing, right? You need to define how you're going to make money to be a company. Open source is irrelevant when it comes to that, right? It's just a component or a facet of what you might be doing. And the command prompt does open source all the time, but it's not how we make our money. It's how we may get someone to pay us right? But we don't make money off of open source specifically. And one of the classic stories around open source, which I find astounding to me, and I find astounding that a lot of people don't know that the software I'm about to bring up. Do you know what Nautilus is?
Say again? No, I'm not sure.
Nautilus.
No.
Okay. Okay. What's your desktop?
My desktop?
Linux,
Mac OS.
or I mean, what, Mac OS?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were a Linux user, it would be largely, there are exceptions, my Linux friends, it's going to be GNOME or it's going to be KDE, right? Largely that's the case. Nautilus is the file manager for GNOME.
Okay.
20 years ago, some engineer convinced somebody with $15 million to invest in a file manager. It was eventually going to have a software store for a bunch of free software. Well, Nautilus doesn't exist anymore. It's just, but if you type in Nautilus at the command line, you get the GNOME file. But going back to my point here, the point there is that just because it checks off your buzzword compliance, AI, I'm looking right at you, doesn't mean you have a viable business plan, especially since AI is largely just a thief, right? We're going to see lawsuits across the board. We're already seeing them from so many companies that are being stolen by certain AI companies. So you need to have a business plan just in general. And then you also need to remember that it's something like 55% of businesses fail in the first 5 years anyway, right? And it has nothing to do with a business plan. It has to do with, that's just market forces. Maybe you were ahead of your time. I mean, one time I was an early investor for a company called Peapod. Well, that was like 2001. Well, what Peapod can be defined as now is DoorDash. It was just ahead of its time, right? So anyway, we talked about open source a little bit, the theory there. Why, in your mind, should we be supporting open source versus, say, closed source solutions, especially when it comes to something like observability, right? We're talking about monitoring, we're talking about trending, analysis of data of your networks, things like that.
So, many years ago already, I wrote a blog post about why open source is eating the world. Paraphrase on the famous software is eating the world. So, I showed it's, open source is no longer the stuff for computer geeks. And as we said, you see leading vendors embracing it, enterprises, governments, cloud providers, system integrators, everyone is playing that game. So, and the fact being that we see successful projects. You talked about the observability side, so things such as Prometheus and OpenTelemetry, or other projects outside of observability like Linux and Kubernetes and so on that scale, reach the scale, the velocity, the versatility, the resilience even that cannot be met really by any single vendor, no matter how big it is and how large, thanks to that global community that we're both talking about. So I think that's the unique angle that says why open source, and obviously open source also provides the transparency and the safe ground for people to collaborate. And we talked about vendors, also for vendors to collaborate, even if there are competitors out there in the commercial market. Here they can collaborate safely. So that's, I think, part of the advantage that boosts the innovation around that. Specifically, if we take the example of observability, then you see, for example, needing to maintain so many different SDKs and client libraries and integrations with so many environments that you need to monitor and observe. That's a mighty heavy task for a single vendor. And you've seen Dynatrace and AppD and many others chasing this infinite chase of the different programming languages that you need to instrument and different infrastructure pieces. You need one for Kafka and one for Redis and one for Apache and one for I don't know what not. And obviously the versioning of each one of these, that's a major pain. And imagine now that you have, for example, one unified open standard and way to consolidate and streamline this sort of telemetry. That takes a very heavy burden off the vendors that then frees them up to really innovate on the back end side of really creating the analytics side, essentially. So this is first evens the playing field, and secondly take something that is pretty much I guess table stakes and makes it open for everyone to just consume and then innovate on top of that. So that's an example from observability. Obviously you can have many examples from other fields as well.
Well, and I think nowadays I think it's important to recognize that everybody's using open source. And when I say everybody, I mean literally everybody. Unless you are an uncontacted tribe on some island, you're using open source. Mac OS is built on open source. Linux is built on open source. Windows, not so much, but they use a ton of open source technologies, not the least of which is graphic rendering. A lot of them open source that they use in Edge and things like that. Android, 75% of the cell phone market worldwide is open source, right? I mean, not all of it, but is built on open source. So this argument that, either closed source is better or we have a smaller team so we can create a better, deployment strategy or whatever the case may be, it just doesn't exist. I mean, if you are on a plane on Delta Airlines and you are using their in-flight entertainment, now it may be a newer version now, but I actually saw it. It was Red Hat 6.2. And that was as early as like 5 years ago. It was still Red Hat 6.2 that they were using to deliver movies while you sat in this tube of, a German folks' nightmare, right? That's what it is. Now, with open source, we know there's always a drive to create something new. And as I get longer in the tooth in my career, I do get frustrated with the why yet another tool that solves the same problem. And when I mean, as an example of that for myself, I'm perfectly happy with SSH and Systat for the stuff that I do. Okay, I don't need anything more than that. Generally speaking, occasionally a graph is useful, but I grew up when text was supposed to have grammatically correct fixed format font, those types of things. So in terms of nowadays, why is it important that we continually improve on observability? I mean, we have all these tools. How are we supposed, why do we keep scratching the same itch? Why don't we move forward? Or why shouldn't we move forward on this?
So I think what you're talking about, that we used to have, SSH to the machines and do some very simple graphs, was fine, I guess, back in the monolith era, not to go back to the mainframe and so on. But today's systems are much more. But today's systems are much more complex. We talked about containerized workloads. I know that you're not a fan of these, but the fact being that many of the architectures out there are based on containerized workloads and cloud native architecture and microservices, and all of that makes up very highly distributed apps, spanning tens or hundreds, if not more nodes, and then services and instances, and obviously very dynamic systems, ephemeral instances, spinning up, tearing down, scaling in and out. So everything is very much today much more dynamic, much more distributed. And then also on the number of layers that you have to monitor and dimensions, it's not just the bare metal and the operating system. Now you have the guest OS and the host OS and the container and the pod and the namespace and the Kubernetes control plane. And so all of that adds up to also very high cardinality, obviously. So, and that's the complexity. That's on one side of the equation. And then on the other side, we're also talking about architectures these days. As you said, many use open source. So many third-party frameworks, many open source, but it could also be cloud services or whatnot, many databases and API gateway and message broker, HTTP proxy, whatnot. And we didn't write them, but we still need to monitor them. So that's the types of challenges, and this makes observability ever more important, if you may, to help us figure out what goes on in our system. So that's, I think, why we haven't cracked it, or because I guess so that we haven't cracked it as much as the architectures have evolved. And actually, not many people know, but the very definition of cloud native by the CNCF talks about systems that are resilient, manageable, and observable. So it's really I guess a trait of cloud native systems. If we talk about cloud native, being a CNCF ambassador, I obviously that's my bread and butter. So, but it's really a characteristic that is an inherent part, or should be an inherent part, of your system, and to my feeling, much more so than what the classic reactive monitoring age that you remember back from the old days. So that's why we need to keep evolving our observability to fit these architectures, the increasing amounts of raw data that they emit, that's also exploding, and to effectively help us, I guess, effectively understand our system.
From the old days. You owe me whiskey for that. I have a question though. So I actually agree with all your points. But I do have a question in regards to a great man by the name of Tom Lane. If you know anything about Postgres, you know Tom Lane. Great guy, brilliant guy. One of the ways he responds sometimes, or has in the past, I should say, is that he will say something to the effect of, I think this is a solution looking for a problem. And I can't help, because of how long I've been in this industry, I can't help but think that things like Kubernetes, containerization, as it sits now, is a solution looking for a problem, because we've always had it. I mean, Solaris has had zones forever. FreeBSD has had jails. Observability, I mean, we've had Zabbix, we've had Nagios, we've had OpenNMS, we've had, there was a proprietary one from HP that I had to work with, and I wanted to kill myself afterwards. But there's nothing, in my mind, there's nothing new that I see. Right now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can enlighten me to something, but we're talking about virtual network. Yep, had that. Firewalls. Yep, had that. Containerization. Yep, had that. Dynamic provisioning. Okay, I'll give you that one. Okay, so what is it that we're gaining from this outside of needing yet something else to do?
Okay, so obviously it's not observability; it's the core containerization movement. I think, yeah, if you look at it in the very abstract manner of virtualization and networking and breaking it down, you had different components. I think the packaging, and it's not just a containerization, it's Kubernetes as a suite. And for me, by the way, Kubernetes is not a framework. It's sort of an open standard or open specification. That's what bundles it together. So if you want to build it yourself based on, VMs and your own load balancing service and networking, routing, whatever, you could do that. The amount of effort that you will put in order to set up the equivalent stack that you get here very well integrated as part of Kubernetes, I'm not sure it's worth the effort. And then again, obviously, the lightweight notion of containers versus virtual machines and so on, I'm not going down this. So, and now there's, WebAssembly that offers more. So I'm not going into, as you said, the chase over buzzword, but the idea is to get the flexibility of workloads with less headache on the operational side. So people tend to think about Kubernetes as complex, but I think that if you actually think about what the alternative is, if you had built it up yourself with all the different components we talked about, the north-south networking and the east-west networking and the routing and traffic steering, that's just the networking, and then take the storage integration with the compute and the higher level services and so on. I think that Kubernetes is actually a compelling offering, but not for everyone. And by that, I definitely agree with you that it's overused, or definitely not considered to its full extent of the complexity that it adds. Because if you do have something that is pretty straightforward, pretty homogeneous, and you can definitely for young stage startups that need to focus on moving fast, I say day in and day out to entrepreneurs coming to ask for my advice, start with a monolith architecture, then evolve it. So definitely going for the copy paste from Uber's latest blog post or Google's research paper, that's a bad habit. And whatever works for this sort of a mega scale, hyper scale type of organization is not definitely what you need as a small scale startup. Understand your needs, your requirements, non-functional, functional, and so on, and then uh, design the architecture. Maybe this me speaking as a former system architect, but design the architecture that meets your needs, not the other ones just because it looked sexy on the blog post. And the community is definitely not the answer for everyone at any point in time.
Well, now I just love you a little bit more because I was expecting a very, you must use this. I was like, no, I mean, like I said, you've been doing this for so long, and we do have clients on Kubernetes that we manage. But we'll get people calling us and they'll be like, hey, we're upgrading Postgres, and while we upgrade Postgres, we want to deploy to Kubernetes. Right? So let's answer that question first. It's not that Kubernetes is bad, but you have 4 machines, right? Why do you need? We need to better manage it and be dynamic. It's like when I used to get on these calls and be like, we need to do agile. I'm like, then do some yoga, right? I mean, it's just, do you even understand what you just said to me? All right. This is about observability, even though I did kind of go off the Kubernetes cliff here. What is it when it comes to observability? And believe me, I am pro observability because of what we do, having to support infrastructure. It is vitally important. But what is it that you wish, if you could implant in everybody's mind a truism about observability, what would it be?
So my, I guess, biggest pain in terms of, the perception is that observability is too often discussed through the lens of the 3 pillars of observability. I hate this term, by the way. And the problem is that this prism very much limits us and organizations generally in actually gaining good observability. So I've been evangelizing for many years with practitioners everywhere to understand that observability is actually a data analytics problem. That's the thing that I would like to have instilled in everyone's minds. Actually, a few years back, I wrote an article about it. I was trying to get some of the practices of big data community back in the day before AI. Big data was the thing, so get some practices from there into DevOps. But the fact being that we haven't really made much progress in the past years. So we're still very much bent on the raw data. And for me, it's time we move beyond the logs, metrics, traces, discourse, beyond the raw data, because what we really are interested in is the insights, is to understand what goes on in our system. So that's for me the biggest crusade and the biggest evangelism task in the past years, at least. Observability is a data analytics problem. Let's treat it as such.
And just for our listeners and viewers, can you give us what the 3 pillars of observability are?
So these are the logs, metrics, and traces that I mentioned before, which are essentially just the telemetry types or signal types that your system emits. Logs,
Okay.
metrics, traces. There are more signals than that, by the way. So 3 pillars, I hate the term because they're more than that. And you shouldn't be bothered by whether it's one of these 3 or something else that you need. Again, system architect's view, just consume the data that serves your purposes. And if you need, I don't know, events or exceptions or continuous profiles or whatnot, use whatever you need to serve the challenges that you need and the architecture that you need.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The big picture, I think, is where you're going with this. It's very common for engineers, and I've certainly done it on my fair share of occasion, is you focus in on this one thing, right? You don't focus in on everything that goes around it that allows this one thing to even matter. And actually, don't even know what this is. But
The floppy disk.
it's just sitting on the desk. What is this? All right. So, we got to talk about the conference just a little bit. We're talking about Open Source Observability Day, so it's been a one-day conference. Sharing knowledge at a conference, a lot of people have different perspectives. I once wrote, and I can't remember the title. I run conferences for Postgres, and years ago, I think it was 2014, I was in a booth and I was talking to somebody, and I overheard a gentleman say, "Why would I help them? They're my competitor," which is a remarkably non-open source remark, right? We're at an open source database conference.
Not open source and not community oriented stake. More than open source, it's community. But yeah,
that's and the thing is that what I think a lot of people forget is that there is so much money for our industry, right? So much money. If you're not making money in this industry, you're probably not doing it right. So you need to reflect on that. You don't need to reflect on the fact that maybe you helped your somewhat competitor solve a problem, right? Now, in my mind, that plays directly into the conference idea. So what are your thoughts on, what are the most important components or takeaways that this conference can give you?
So first of all, obviously, I'm very honored to be a keynote speaker at Open Source Observability Day and join other international experts. And what I said before is exactly that. As a community, and that's the operative word for me, as a community, we need these places to share knowledge with others around the world without borders. That's especially for the online conferences such as this. So, and I've been running the Open Observability Talks podcast for the past 5 years exactly for that, to share knowledge, to share updates, best practices, to provide the stage for experts. This month I had the creator of Jaeger with me talking about the Jaeger V2 that is coming out, and last month I had the creator of Prometheus talking about Prometheus V3 and the PromCon outcomes of. Yeah, whether it could be that, it could be, I don't know, the CTO of the CNCF or end users from Meta or eBay or whatnot. The idea is that you have these forums which are online and free for all, just like this conference, that help us share knowledge and expand our horizons, essentially. So for me, this is really an essential part of establishing, maintaining community and exchange, formalizing and facilitating, exchanging knowledge.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, the slogan for the Postgres conference is people, Postgres data. Basically, we're all about people who use Postgres and related technologies who love data. And we do it, it's a nonprofit. And, we don't do it to make money. We do it because, especially in today's world, in our community, being the open source community, you're sitting in Israel right now. Yeah. I'm sitting in Washington State. We're like 8,000 miles apart, right? So how do we bring each other together? How do we share a meal? How do we, maintain a relationship as well as move the world, right? That's what it is for us. As we get close
by
to
the
wrap
way, just on the other hand, I'm really a great fan of the local in-person community. So for me, it's a complementary motion. And I used to be an organizer for DevOps days and for Kubernetes community days and other events. So there's also a thing about people getting in one room together, sharing a beer, pizza, whatnot, and chatting. Usually the best times for me on these meetups or whatnot were the times between the lectures and between the talks, where you actually got to chat and find a like-minded someone, doing something very similar to you. You weren't even aware that you live in the same city and facing the same challenges, and the next day you have someone to pick up the phone and consult with and brainstorm with, or have an interesting coffee with. So this complementary motion of having the local communities together with global online virtual communities, that's something that really, if you have both of these going, and I think the Postgres community is an amazing example for that, by the way, that's the best solution for me, to build the local groups that have very tight relations, and then you have the broader and the proliferation, the cross proliferation between these is just astonishing when it works right.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we call at the conferences or meetups, that's what we call the hallway track,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's great to go to a presentation, don't get me wrong, but where you make the real connections and make the real progress is just like you said, it's that hallway track. Now, this, I want to make sure we stay within close to our time limit here. I just have a couple of final questions.
Sure.
This is an interesting question to me. What is the future of open source software? And I don't know if you know this or not, but Bruce Perens, I'm sure you know who Bruce is, has started this post-open movement, which I think is kind of premature, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on either that, or if you don't have thoughts on that, just what you think the future of open source is.
So we talked before about why I think open source matters, but then again, as we said, there is these recent years the thing about open source. I call it open source turning to the dark side. I started using this term a few years back in a blog post, and then I gave a few talks, and funnily enough, that was the hot topic of Open Source Summit Europe that took place just a couple of months ago, and suddenly I saw my blog post from a few years back with the title open source turning to the dark side. So that's really the hot topic with the big names that we talked about, Terraform and Redis and all these changing. And I think this is, many people are concerned about that. As I said, that was the hot topic. And people start asking, so is that the end of open source? Is like open source not viable any longer because you can't have open source without vendors invested in it. And if vendors then can flip the switch, then what is it viable? For me, I don't think this is the case. I think actually it's part of maturing up. And I do see the community gathering behind folks like OpenSearch for Elasticsearch or OpenTofu for Terraform and so on, and really to keep them open for successful projects with viable, vibrant communities. And I'm encouraged that actually open source really will come out even stronger out of that. So for me, it's really exciting. Obviously, there's a lot. You pulled me into the AI talk. I know that everyone likes AI. So there's a whole different branch of discussion about open source that is really hot these days about what is open source in the realm of AI, when it's not just software, open source software, but rather also models and weights and what constitutes even an open source AI. So that's a whole different discussion that we're now just starting to scratch the surface about that one. So yeah, open source is definitely here to stay. That's not a question. I think we are evolving, as I said, in companies understanding what it means to build a business model around open source, what it means to be involved in open source in a way that is conducive to the community, but still leaves a business sense and a business viability on their side. And on the other hand, we see, as I said, the evolution of open source beyond the traditional software realm and maybe a bit of hardware that we used to have into new realms such as AI and machine learning and deep learning modeling and so on.
Yeah, and I actually think you touched on right there. You touched on why open source is going to continue to be pervasive in the room. When Elastic did their deal with Elasticsearch, and Amazon forked it to OpenSearch, a lot of people were like, well, no one's going to contribute. It's just going to be Amazon's new product. When in fact, that has proven to be exactly the opposite. And the same with OpenTofu, which I love that. It's the way it should be. I remember when open source projects were just ridiculously silly names. OpenTofu, and I know there's a reason behind OpenTofu, but it's perfect. But it shows the power of open source, right? It shows that the power of community and the resource that is the code, or the asset that is the code, doesn't die, right? If someone tries to you can't take it. You can fork it, but you can't take it. And that is, I mean, even with the latest, WordPress debacle, what a lot of people don't realize is that there's nothing stopping any company with some resources of forking WordPress and putting up its own app layer and releasing a plugin that changes where they get their store, right, for their extensions and plugins and things. Now, I'm not making light of the effort that would take, but it is definitely doable, right? And that is the true power of open source in my mind.
Yeah,
All
although
right,
I should mention just briefly, open source, people obviously think about the source code, which is what you're talking about, fork the source code and do whatever you want with it. Open source is much more than the source code. And by the way, this is why many people get confused with the source available types of licenses, SSPL and others, and think because the source is available, that's open source. So first of all, for all the listeners that don't know, source available is not open source. But
correct.
that's why I'm saying we need to look beyond. And I think the WordPress saga is a classic for that, because it actually put the spotlight on the trademark. Can you actually
Mhm.
call yourself WordPress? So yeah, you can take the source code and do something with it. I'm not going into down this what you can and can't do, but you can't call it WordPress. And that's the
That's
interesting part there, where they separated between the source code and the trademark. And so a lot more than just the source code is, and that's part of the I think the process of maturing up with open source to understand software has many elements, part of which are even the graphic elements and some other DLL like dynamically linked libraries, whatnot. You really need to think about the whole package and understand what's the meaning of that. And that's even without going down the AI path that adds additional layers of modeling and weights and stuff like that, and the training data that you use. So that's what we need to understand beyond just the source code.
No, and you're correct. And this isn't the first time that this has been an issue. Red Hat and CentOS back in the day, back in the old days, as you put it. But Red Hat handled it a lot better, I think. Red Hat wasn't out there to demonize people. They just wanted to protect rightfully their marks. And CentOS continued. They just said, okay, we'll rip that out so that we're not, breaking that. But to close this out, you said you're a keynote speaker, so talk to us about that. What is a taste of what you're going to be talking about at the conference? What will people take away from your presentation?
So at Open Source Observability Day, I'm going to talk about OpenTelemetry, which is an open source project that I've had the privilege of escorting for many years. And really, OpenTelemetry brings a unified framework for generating and collecting observability data. Just like we talked before about the benefits of open source, and I talked about, hinted to this benefit that brings us really a step closer to the vision of unified observability. And it's a fascinating project. It's actually today the second most active project in the CNCF, so second only to Kubernetes itself, which can tell you how active it is, and quickly becoming really a de facto standard in this realm. So I'll talk about why you need it, the components and capabilities that it provides, and how to effectively adopt it to your organization. So that's for those who are less familiar, and even for if you are familiar with OpenTelemetry, you'll find it interesting because I'll give some highlights of cutting edge stuff done there, like around eBPF, new telemetry signals beyond the three pillars we talked about before, real user monitoring, and much more. So definitely should be a great talk for those interested to learn about OpenTelemetry and for those wanting to get the latest update.
All right. Well, with that, this has been more than a refresh in the Open Observability Day interviews. Our guest today was Dotan Horovits, CNCF ambassador and Open Observability Talks podcast host. Make sure if you're into observability, make sure you check out his podcast. Thanks for being on,
And
Dotan.
may the open source be with you.
Maybe open source be with you.